Them belly full, but we hungry. A hungry mob is a hungry mob. A rain a fall, but the judge it tough. A yatta yuck, but the youth not enough. You're gonna dance to jam music, dance. We're gonna dance to jam music, dance. Oh, forget your troubles and dance. Forget your sorrows and dance. Forget your sickness and dance. Forget your weakness and dance. Cost of living gets so high, rich and...
Good morning, and welcome to this event that the Stimson Center is co-hosting with the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. We're delighted to share this stage with our friends at Georgetown as they release their wonderful report on Peace Through Food, a timely summation of the state of food insecurity, and it offers a way forward in considering the power of peace building to resolve global hunger. I'm Johanna Mendelson, Foreman of the Stimson Center, and I will be your moderator this morning. Our distinguished panelists are listed in the program along with their bios and links to websites. And in the interest of time, we will only refer to them by name. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules. Please send your questions to the Q&A so that we can share them with the panelists and respond in a timely way. And finally, just a quick thank you, which isn't enough, for my colleague at Stimson, Dr. Richard Ponzio, and assistant Banu Arjaman for all their work on this effort, and to the ISD staff, our sincere thanks to Alistair Somerville, whose editorial guidance and support was invaluable. And without further ado, I want to introduce you to Brian Finley, President and CEO of the Stimson Center, who will start us off. We will be followed by Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, and our panelists, and Ambassador Barbara Bodine, Director of the Institute at Georgetown, will close our program this morning. Thank you, Brian. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for the introduction, and a very good day to all of you from wherever you are tuning in from. It's such an honor to be co-hosting this event with our friends and colleagues at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Ambassador Bodine, a real pleasure indeed. We're launching today, of course, as Johanna mentioned, a study, Peace Through Food, which I really do commend to you. It's a remarkable report that I think will not just help guide the debate and guide a debate that, if I may, my colleague Johanna Mendelson Foreman, whom you have heard from already and will hear from again shortly, really helps to inspire, I think, on the nexus of food and national security. So grateful to you as well, Johanna, for encouraging us all into this really important space. If I can just quickly, with your permission, Johanna, oversimplify the report. It really, in my view, has three main takeaways. Number one, that food really should be considered a human right. It's very much in keeping, I think, with a larger awareness around the recognition of human dignity that Mark Lagon and others have been pushing for many years. Secondly, that food security is a core component of stability and peace. And Chase Sova, who joins us today, great to see you, Chase. He's done, I think, in my view, some of the most pioneering work in this space. I think it's also important to note that his work and others is having a real, tangible, and measurable impact. We saw, for instance, in 2018, a UN Security Council resolution that essentially made the weaponization of food grounds for collective action. And third, last, that fundamental reform of the global food system, global supply chains, really is essential to ensure that less developed countries are not victims of food shortages or price hikes as a result of variable weather of climate change. These are the issues that we will wrestle with this morning. And so you have seen and see on your screen and see in the program a great line of speakers, and you're in for a real treat. We're going to have a lot of fun here and learn from one another as we draw you all into the conversation as well. Maybe just, if I may, Johanna, one more public service announcement before I turn over the virtual gavel here. My colleague Richard Ponzio will be hosting an issue adjacent event next Thursday, September 23rd, where Stimson will launch our latest report on a related subject of building a sustainable recovery. And that new analysis, again, which I will commend to you, brings forward 20 different proposals for battling COVID and the climate crisis simultaneously. And I think it's well worth this particular audience's attention. And you can check more information on that in the chat box a little later here on the program. And so, because she did not get a proper introduction, let me just also say that she is a distinguished fellow with the Stimson Center. You are more likely to know her as the eighth wonder of the world, not just for the remarkable career that she has had through government, in philanthropy, in the think tank community here in Washington, but as someone as well who really in every role and every facet of her career has had a measurable impact, not just in helping all of us, I think, better define debates around key issues, but also really in making a positive impact in the lives of so many individuals around the world that are caught in conflict. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I give you my friend and colleague and your moderator for our event, Johanna Mendelsohn-Forman.
Wow, Brian, now you've taken an extra minute and we're going to have to cut off Kelly's time. I'm going to turn this over to Kelly McFarland, who is the Director of Research and Programs at ISD, and also the one of the holding the pen on this report to summarize the report for us briefly before we go to our panel. Kelly?
Yeah, thanks, Johanna, and thanks, Brian, for the introduction. And I'd just like to reiterate my thanks to Johanna and the whole team at Stimson for working with us on this today, Richard Ponzio and Banu Arjamand, and all the help they've given us on this event. Also to Alistair Somerville, our case studies and publications editor. And I also like to mention our research assistants, Kit Evans and Eleanor Hughes, who helped with this working group report and the event as well. And as Johanna mentioned, I'm going to provide an overview of the report and sort of its background and how it came to be. But in the spring of 2021, we here at ISD held 2 scholar practitioner working group meetings to discuss this issue of food insecurity and how it relates to instability and conflict, and then to provide a set of recommendations for those that are working on this challenge. This culminated in a report that has been mentioned so far called Peace Through Food, Ending the Hunger Instability Nexus, which you can read on our website. And 3 of the reoccurring themes that came out of our working group meetings and the report are the separate but interrelated issues of COVID, conflict, and climate. Each drives increased food insecurity in its own way, but they also exacerbate challenges that the other issues create. For example, in Ethiopia, environmental change and COVID restrictions had already made food security in the Tigray region difficult, but increased fighting has pushed many to famine levels. As our report highlights, these 3 key issues, along with other drivers, have created a situation in which we produce more than enough food for the world's population, but more and more people have been going hungry in recent years. Nearly 1 billion people, at a minimum, are malnourished, and according to the UN, the number of food insecure people in the world increased by an estimated 318 million people in 2020, which was due in large part to the pandemic. In May of 2021, global food prices rose at their fastest level in more than a decade, and the food price index remains at its highest level since September 2011. The COVID-19 pandemic that triggered unprecedented lockdowns in countries around the world vividly demonstrates how disease outbreak and the resulting safety protocols have a direct and serious effect on food security, and not just in poor countries. The pandemic is a global shock to food systems and people's lives. As the International Food Policy Research Institute states, COVID-19 has exposed fragilities in food systems, especially in labor-intensive systems. The breakdown of supply chains due to the virus infection itself and a variety of policy restrictions has caused consumer prices to increase and producer prices to fall at the same time, increasing food insecurity. Our report also touches upon conflict as a major driver of food insecurity. According to meeting participants, fragile and conflict-affected states account for a vast amount of the world's food insecure. Individuals and groups caught in the midst of fighting find it harder to secure the requisite nutrition to sustain healthy daily diets, and many become food insecure. This is especially true for small landholders and farmers, the majority of whom live in conflict regions. As with climate change, the conflict food insecurity nexus is oftentimes a feedback loop where conflict leads to food insecurity, which in turn can cause further or elongated fighting over depleted resources. Conflict drives individuals and groups in their land, destroys crops and livestock, makes access to resources such as water more difficult, and causes delays in planting or harvesting. Indirectly, conflict also disrupts farmers' access to feed and fertilizers and can cut off agricultural investment. As working group participants bemoaned, weaponization of food access is also increasingly a military tactic. The rise in global temperatures over the past century, the increase in the number and severity of storms, and worsening droughts and floods, in other words, climate change, is, as most of us are aware, a major contributor to food insecurity. As the recent IPCC report states, observed climate change is already affecting food security through increasing temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and greater frequency of some extreme events. And food security will be increasingly affected by projected future climate change. Our report came to the conclusion that ultimately, an end to food insecurity requires three strands of policymaking: to re-envision food security as a basic human right, to rethink universal food security as a core component of stability and peace, and to reform the global food system and distribution networks to address these shifts, as Brian mentioned. Governments, NGOs, international organizations, and the private sector have already provided a foundation, but it's not yet sufficient to address the issues moving forward. Our report outlined a few key areas to focus on. Firstly, a shift in our frame of reference is necessary. A new framework and vocabulary for food needs to take a proactive approach that re-envisions food security through the lens of social protection, social safety nets, and as a global commons right. Secondly, the food system must become more resilient and coordination must improve. Food insecurity often arises due to single points of failure, often foreseeable, which demand humanitarian interventions. Hardwired resilience at all points in the food system, from plant to pantry, would enable the system to withstand and adapt to periodic disruptions. And thirdly, ground-up approaches should be front and center. While international coordination must improve, prevailing views among global policymakers do not always translate well to local conditions. Some may even drive conflict. Local leadership and local ownership of programs are essential, but interventions also require government funding and dialogue between all parties. In contexts with unreliable or uneven governance, a focus on the community level may be the best means we have to mitigate conflict driven by food scarcity. And with that, I will turn it back over to Johanna, and thank you again, and thanks to the panelists as well. I really appreciate it.
Many thanks, Kelly. We're going to go to our discussants first. So we're going to start with Chase Silva, who's the Senior Director of Public Policy and Research at the World Food Program. We'll be followed by Adriana Abner, co-founder and Executive Director of Plataforma CIPO in Brazil. Rod Schoonover, head of the Ecological Security Project, will be next. And Devery Borgner-Vorvik, who is founder and CEO of Devery BV Sustainable Strategies, will be the fourth speaker. And then we will have a discussion and close with Ambassador Bodine. So over to you, Chase.
Great. Thank you, Johanna, and I appreciate the invite to be here today. And it's fun to be alongside so many friends and colleagues here and familiar faces. Kelly, thanks to you and the team for the invitation to join the working group back in April and contribute some insights. I'm with the World Food Program USA. We're a nonprofit organization based here in Washington, D.C. that supports the mission of the United Nations World Food Program in the American market. We do that in a bunch of different ways, but one of them, of course, is participating in conversations like these, just to make sure that we're at the tip of the spear when it comes to thinking about issues, themes, and topics that are affecting WFP operations all around the world. So my participation in this space, in the sort of food conflict nexus space, really began in 2017 and with a report that we produced back in that period on food-related instability. You know, I think in 2007 and 2008, there was a growing consensus and recognition that food insecurity in and of itself could be driving conflict. Those price riots that occurred during that period were sort of canaries in the coal mine and driving that broader conversation. But at that point, I think even as work was emerging on this, the food conflict relationship really still belonged to the realm of the anecdotal. I mean, you go up to Capitol Hill, and I think lawmakers there intuitively understood that food insecurity played a role in instability. along that time period, I remember Lindsey Graham making comments like "feed them now or fight them later," and former Senator Pat Roberts saying things like "show me a nation that can't feed itself and I'll show you a nation in chaos." So there was a sort of baseline understanding and an intuition that this relationship existed. Winning the peace was our effort to sort of draw this out into the empirical, and it was a systematic review. You guys can find that and read that. That's not the point of the conversation today. What I want to comment on briefly is really, what has happened since 2017 between the time of that writing and the time of this excellent report produced by ISD and team. Now, if I were to kind of summarize what we've seen in the world over that 5-year period, I mean, we have, of course, seen an increase in climate-related migration in hotspots around the world. We're seeing that in the Northern Triangle. We're seeing that in the Sahel. Stories of conflict between pastoralists and agricultural communities are now pretty commonplace. We are on the precipice, as Kelly mentioned, and others in the introduction, of another food price crisis here, with prices approaching what we saw in 11, maybe even 7 and 8 in certain markets. There has been a tremendous rise over this period in the rise of non-state actors and people who have been displaced from their homes because of violence, conflict, and persecution. And broadly speaking, global hunger numbers have spiked, right? They've risen consistently over the past 5 years and pretty dramatically over the last year. We are looking now at 600,000 people who are likely facing famine conditions in 2021 in about 4 countries. We've got on their heels 41 million people in 43 countries who are one step removed from that famine classification. So really nothing new here in terms of trends. We're just traveling further and further and further down the same terrible trend line. Now, what has happened at the policy level, and I think Brian did a great job in framing this, what has happened at the policy and sort of narrative level over the last 5 years is we have seen the UN Security Council weighing in on this topic with Resolution 2417. I don't want to beat that horse, but that's a really interesting development at that level. The following year, we saw some statutes amended in the International Criminal Court that looked at starvation as a war crime. WFP, of course, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this year and increased recognition for the way that that organization affects people in conflict settings and fights the use of food as a weapon of war. And then, as the report rightly notes, and I think there's 2 big trends happening here, right? One is that there is an acknowledgement that food is an important first order tool of stabilization. I really like that language that your team used in there, Kelly. And then, personally, I think there's new momentum around the right to food movement, and really this has been shepherded in particular with the UN Food System Summit coming up in September and the pre-summit held in July. So all of that is kind of normative and narrative and deals with how we think about the issue. But you're also seeing tangible examples of how this translates, right? In the Northern Triangle, the Biden administration is focusing more on root causes. I think you're going to start seeing greater investments in livelihood, agricultural development, and short-term humanitarian assistance there. I think in the Sahel, WFP is moving away from sort of short-term relief to longer-term resilience building. That means providing food assistance conditionally in exchange for work projects on land reclamation and rehabilitation. All of these things are helping to de-escalate those conflicts that we're seeing in that region. We've learned important lessons about trade protectionism in the last 10 years after COVID-19 spike sort of threatened to see the rise of protectionism again. This time period, we only saw export restrictions in about 20 nations, accounting for 5% of global grain trade. That wasn't anywhere near what we saw in 2008 and 2007. That, of course, has an impact on food price riots. And then finally, I will mention, we've also seen a tremendous expansion in the last 5 years of social protections and safety net systems. WFP during COVID-19 was approached by no fewer than 50 countries to help expand safety net protections in response to COVID-19. Countries with those strong social protection systems in place, they suffer least and they recover fastest from crisis. Social protection can really break the link between a food shock and a conflict. So I'll leave it there to ensure we've got enough time for everybody, but those are some of my comments and reflections.
Thank you so much, Chase. I'm not going to waste any more time, but turn this over to Adriana, who is an excellent commentator on climate and a view from Brazil. So thank you. Adriana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and congratulations to both the group at Georgetown and Stimson for this report. I read it very carefully because the topic is very relevant to the work that we do here at Plataforma Cipó in several partnerships. And I found it extremely useful, both conceptually and in terms of some of the concrete details. So let me highlight very briefly 2 ways in which the report is especially useful for the work that we do at Cipó. And then I will talk a little bit about some recommendations that we are working on how donor countries and multilateral funds can help to finance and implement climate sensitive projects in conflict affected states, which has been a major challenge and helps to explain why there's such a gap between commitments made to adaptation and the actual investments so far. And I think the report has really helped me to articulate some of these recommendations. So first, I think the report lays out very well some of the major pathways through which climate exacerbates or multiplies security risks in reference not only to extreme weather events, but also slow onset phenomena such as loss of soil productivity, which we have quite a bit in Central America, for instance, as well as the interaction between these 2 ideal types, because of course they're not mutually exclusive. The increasing frequency and unpredictability of patterns of precipitation with resulting floods and droughts, very often in the same spaces, alternating between these types of disasters. We've seen massive swarms of locusts in Yemen, in parts of the Sahel, and of course heat waves that are being that are already very well documented in many parts of the world, including here in Latin America. And it's very important to remember, of course, that agriculture in much of the developing world is either rain-fed, so affected by these patterns, or is fed by runoff from glaciers, which are melting. So the proportion of the population that's directly or indirectly threatened by risks to food insecurity is really massive, and I think tends to be understated. Today we had a briefing with Adele Thomas from the University of the Bahamas, who's the IPCC report. She's on that board, and she was talking about how her country, the Bahamas, had not yet recovered from a major storm and is now having to deal with COVID, but without the resources that were there before for addressing climate change. So you have the compound disasters and crises, of course, within a context in which governance is inadequate or in which politics drives it towards climate change rather than towards mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. The second point that I found very interesting, and that's suggested by the text, although they're in sort of adjacent areas, is that it's impossible for us to talk about climate change without making reference to environmental degradation. And Brazil is the perfect example of how this can lead to what I think it was Ambassador Bodine who wrote in the foreword, that you have this perverse commoditization of food and weaponization, securitization. And Brazil is one of the world's top exporter of commodities. The export of beef and soybeans has skyrocketed. It's generating massive wealth for the top 0.111% of the population. But at the same time, we're seeing rates of hunger also take off very steeply, including in rural areas like the Amazon and urban ones. So thinking about that intersection, the vicious cycle that interconnects climate change and environmental degradation is really key to understanding issues around food. And then finally, the recommendation that we have been working on as part of a project at Cipó with different partners has to do with the criteria that donor countries, multilateral funds, other actors, including civil society, have to develop in order to be able to work in conflict-affected settings, including with respect to food security issues. Because our sense is that there isn't yet enough systematized knowledge about what it takes to implement a project in Afghanistan, to implement a project in Eastern Congo, or even in Guatemala in our region. It's not the same as implementing a traditional development project or even a humanitarian project. So I look forward to further exchanges, and I want to end by saying something. I was very happy to see in the dissemination of this report the word hunger. I know that it's not exactly the same thing, but in policy circles, and Brazilian scholars have really been insisting on this. It's very important that we don't just talk about food insecurity. We need to talk about hunger, because that's what's happening in the streets here in Rio, in the Amazon, elsewhere in the world. And when we talk about food insecurity, sometimes that gets diluted in the policy discourse. So again, congratulations. Thank you very much. And I look forward to see what else comes out of this. Obrigada.
Muito obrigada, Adriana, and thank you for those important comments. I'm going to turn it over to Rod Schoonover, who has informed us on many issues of food and national security, including writing the wonderful intelligence estimate of 2015. But bring us up to date, Rod. Over to you.
Well, first, congratulations to the Georgetown authors on this outstanding report. And thanks to the organizers at Stimson for inviting me. It's always great to come here. So as Joanna said, I spent a decade in the US intelligence community analyzing stresses to critical Earth systems, including food. And much of my current work is understanding and addressing complex and converging risks of the 21st century. And food insecurity, including hunger, is a core systemic risk that intersects and exacerbates a number of other complex stresses. Food is not only deeply interconnected with climate change, as we just heard from the prior panelist, but also with drivers of ecological disruption, such as deforestation and pressures on soil health. There are few topics as central as food. In 2015, the US intelligence community released our unclassified assessment on food that looked at the national security implications of global food security. Just incidentally, that followed on the 2008 National Intelligence Estimate on Climate Change and our 2011 National Intelligence Estimate on Water Security. It seemed as we were going through and looking at these evolving stresses in the 21st century, we naturally went from climate change to water to food and increasing complexity as well. And like in the ISD's Peace Through Food report, we found that the basic issue was one of distribution, access, human disruption or distortion of supply chains. We hyper-focus on food supply at our own peril. And we came to this conclusion in our 2015 report. I think the COVID pandemic and extreme weather events have really brought to light the jeopardy that perturbations to the global food supply chain or global food system is really needs to be thought of as a national security issue. Now, also from the ISD report, quote, the international community must undertake a wholesale rethink of food security, leading to major reform of the food system as we know it. And I couldn't agree with that statement more. I'm not sure that many of our policymakers have quite come to grips with these vulnerabilities. I'm hoping that this report gets a ton of readership. I'd argue that we also need a rethink of US national security, whose doctrine and architecture has been arguably outdated for quite some time. Needs to be recalibrated to reflect the threat that the country faces. And really, as this evolution is occurring literally under our feet, we're not really just talking about US national security, but the national securities of a great number of countries. And desertification, heat waves, wildfires, ecological damage, locust swarms, these all put enormous pressures on people and systems. that threaten the stability, not just of developing and developed countries, but of the international network. And so I think before I turn it over, I think we need to accelerate this move that's already happening towards a national security 3.0, if you will, where actor-less threats, such as those posed by climate change, ecological disruption, including those involving food, and pandemic risk are fully addressed. And I'm going to bounce it back, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Rod, for your comments. I'm going to turn this over to Deborah Borgner-Vorvik, who will bring it home on some of the issues that this report implies for the private sector, given her deep knowledge of that community. So Deborah, over to you. Thank you this morning.
Thank you, Joanna. And it's an honor to be included in such an esteemed panel. And I too want to congratulate the authors for elevating this important discussion. Of course, it's timely, and it was probably timed around the UN Food Systems Summit. What I want to say at the outset, which isn't in my notes, is I've spent my career in food and agriculture, and never has there been a moment where I have seen so many new players and new actors come into the discussion. And I do believe that COVID elevated the issue to a point that globally, citizens and governments and community leaders, et cetera, began to say, wait a second, what's going on with our food system? For many, many years, I worked alongside and lobbied alongside many people in the food industry. And there is a subset of individuals who truly understand how the food system works. And what I will say at the outset, what I have always understood and always believed, is that we know the answers. In fact, we understand the economic imperative, the social imperative. We know how food is produced. We know how to get food from where it is to where it needs to be. And at the end of the day, it comes down to core political will. And what we're seeing with the UN Food Systems Summit is that we are bringing together stakeholders at this critical point in time to come up with some new ideas on how to advance that political will. And so, but we do have in our toolkit the policies that need to be in place. And the bigger challenge that we'll see is at the local levels, we will see the conflict, much what Chase mentioned in terms of different communities beginning to come in conflict, but actually food is also now shaping our geopolitical climate and the conflicts that are beginning to exist. And what I want to say at the outset is there's an interesting dynamic going on during the UN Food Systems Summit, and I'll use the United States and China. Whereas China is stepping in and saying, we've already solved for SDG 1, zero poverty, and SDG 2, zero hunger, 10 years ahead of time before 2030. And so you can come and learn from us, and you have other players saying there are a whole other set of dynamics that need to come into play to solve for the overall system. So I was asked early on in terms of my participation to give some of the mentality of the private sector. And I hearken back to the food price spikes of 2008, standing in front of a printer in my office, printing off this giant piece of work that I had written internally on why the private sector should establish that access to food is a basic human right. And I remember debating a colleague saying, well, what would that mean? We would be under attack if the private sector said it's a basic human right. And I said, no. It's how we facilitate that right and our role in facilitating that right. So we no longer need to debate that access to food is a basic human right. We need to talk about what is the private sector's role. And I will say in 2008, when the price spikes hit, globally, the private sector did come together. I can point you to the New Vision on Agriculture, where for the first time I saw civil society, private sector, government really making an earnest evaluation of what do we need to do to vision food security for the future. And that is a very relevant effort to the report that's being put out today. What I will say is that the UN Food Security Summit will begin to define where we have points of agreement and points of conflict. it's what happens after the summit that's really important. And the private sector participation in the food system summit has been controversial. A lot of different groups pointing out, gee, we're not represented. Well, quite frankly, there have been over 450 multi-stakeholder dialogues around the world that have fed into this discussion. My only criticism of private sector involvement in the food system summit and the solution is there's not enough of it. And what I mean by that is we have traditional players at the table, the food industry, the industry that focuses on the inputs, maybe some of the transportation industry, some of financial sector. But where the great opportunity lies for us moving forward is to bring all of the different sectors to the table around, Adriana, I like this what you're saying, the notion of hunger and food security. Companies cannot operate in failed states, and the most basic building block of society is food security. That's first and foremost the basic human right that will facilitate whether a society can function today and tomorrow. So what I would say is that for every corporation that's working to contribute to food security, that's great, Chase. There's not enough diversity in the support to the World Food Program and to others from other sectors, despite how hard you work, despite the fact that David Beasley is out there saying, look, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates and others, if you would just give this amount, we could feed 41 million people. What every company really needs, whether they are in the technology sector or whether they're in financial services or any other sector, is they need to have a policy on how they are contributing to food security. Beyond what's our views on taxes, what's our views on transportation. It's every company should have a food security expert, and we've got lots of them here. But also, are they stepping up to the plate as it relates to advancing trade policies, advancing supplemental nutrition assistance worldwide? What are their views on sanctions? And food must move despite the fact that countries are in conflict. What are they doing in terms of planning, not just for disaster, the preparedness, but how they respond to disaster? So there's a whole scope of opportunity for companies to actually play a larger role. And what I will end with is to say that this is not a new issue for all of us that are here together, continuing to raise the issue. That's fine, but this is an age-old issue. And looking into each country's public policy infrastructure and how that's playing out at the ground level is really critical, because where the situation is the most difficult is at the local level, and that's where we have the least amount of resources. So it's both a global issue of what are the policies shaping the global infrastructure. It's a national issue, but really, what are we doing to empower at the local level as private sector a collective view on food security in these communities? I'll stop there.
Deborah, thank you as always for a great overview, and thank you to all the panelists for that. We have a lot of questions that have come up, and I'd like to get right to them before we have closing remarks. I wish we had 2 hours for this because the questions are wonderful. Let me go to a question that we had from Corey Boot. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, for Chase. Do we have an idea of the impact of for example, global droughts, extreme weather events on global food security? Okay, would you like to answer that,
Sure.
Chase?
I'm happy to give it a start, and then I'm sure others will want to jump in on the back of this. The sort of baseline understanding of impacts on food security are produced every year as it relates to climate change. And I would say last year in 2020, we had about 30 million additional people internally displaced because of climate related extreme events. So that obviously has an impact downstream on food security in those places. If you look at the Global Report on Food Crisis, which is the sort of flagship report that sort of outlines the number of people facing acute hunger in places around the planet, We've seen that number rise pretty steadily over the last couple of years, from 80 million to 120 to 135 to 155. That number is marching upwards because of climate-related extreme events and a confluence of that and conflict and economic insecurity as a result of COVID-19. So numbers are going in the wrong direction. It's being driven in part by climate impacts. If you look into the future, you can expect another 180 million people forced into hunger with a 2-degree warming level. Once you get up into 4 and 5 degrees Celsius mean temperature increases, you're talking billions of people affected by increased food security because of that. So no specific number yet that I can point you to for 2021. Somebody else might be able to do that, but forced displacement is up and numbers for 2 and 4 degrees Celsius are pretty scary.
Thanks, Chase. I'd like to get to a next question, and then if anybody wants to chime in on numbers, we can go forward. But I'd like to get this question to Adriana. What possibilities, it's from Chris Wagner, what possibilities do you see for establishing international institutions or committees that would globally address these complex issues at the intersection of climate change, food, and health issues? Adriana?
Sure. I'm not one of the authors of the report, but I can chime in. So I think the first thing that we have to do is first utilize the existing mechanisms rather than invent new ones. And I think that the UN system in particular already has the capillary reach. And now, because of the creation of the UN Climate and Security Mechanism, which is developing a series of toolkits and climate risk assessments, there's a possibility of mainstreaming this topic, not only within food security strictly writ, but also related parts of the UN system like trade, right? Or areas that deal with family agriculture. So not just the World Food Program. But I do think there is a need for certain normative frameworks. So to give an example, what I was referring to when I made my comments, we need a set of criteria for implementing climate risk projects in conflict affected settings, because even the Adaptation Fund, the big funds, the multilateral organizations, they're doing it on an ad hoc basis for the most part, and there isn't a global conversation. So I think there is space to start normative frameworks around this issue. That will be very important.
Thank you, Adriana. I want to go to a question for Rod from Jeff Heffron. It seems there's a clear nexus between food and stability, both domestically and internationally. Are there lessons learned from our domestic efforts to inform our efforts overseas, Rod?
That's a good question. That may be a question for someone else on the panel. I don't really study domestic. Just speculatively, I think there are some basic dynamics at work that that probably underpin both domains, but I offhand don't. I couldn't draw on that.
Let me ask. I know Kelly, are you there? Because
yeah,
reference. Do you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I think, and I can make comments to both of the first questions, but the
Thank
first
you.
question on new sort of systems or institutions, I think one of the things that we underlined in the report as well is that panelists or working group members did mention and noted that a lot of the infrastructure that's already in place is good, but we need to sort of rethink how we're using them, and that gets to Adriana's point a little bit. And I think what we're starting to see is, having the first UN Food Summit in 25 years, I think is a move in the right direction. So that's an answer to the first question. And then on the domestic side of things, I can't point to necessarily any specific policies or programs in particular, but what I would say is that one of the things that was highlighted again and again in the working group was this notion that where we are seeing some success, security is at the local level, and that's in many different regions. And one of the things that we highlighted was the notion that many times taking the local and then working up from there, so sort of that domestic idea within countries, and then expanding upon that, what works and what doesn't work, while also understanding that it's not necessarily going to be a top-down plug-and-play system, that you have to understand the differences on the ground for each country or region when you implement programs. But I do think there is a local element that can be expanded out.
Thank you, Kelly. I want to give two questions to Devery. They're somewhat related, but first, Devery, what role should agricultural technology play in the development of inclusive value chains in developing nations? And getting to a second point that was made by Bibi de la Luz about the role of companies in what they're doing to let people know about nutrition and food security, to be making that information public. How do you make public this information on products and nutritious and healthy food? So combining them, there are two separate questions, but in the interest of time, and I want to leave time for Ambassador Bodine, could you respond to those?
Yeah, just briefly, and I'm willing to have a conversation offline. The Food System Summit will be addressing ag tech, and I think the answer is in the question itself. How does technology become a force for inclusivity? And in fact, we're seeing signs of disruptive technology, disrupting some of the larger, more established, what you would say, consolidated players, and putting more power of information and data in the hands of smallholders, et cetera. But that conversation and actually that entire technology dialogue focused central on inclusivity needs to continue. Access to technology, of course, is critical. When governments are negotiating different agreements, that should be front and center. That's a short answer to a very big, wider conversation. And then access to nutrition. I mean, this is a really important point, because this came home during COVID, which is health and wellness is now on the front of everyone's mind. And even though it has been one of the most critical issues, is food security is not just about access to calories, it's the access to the right type of calories. And that's where rightly the food industry has been criticized, and many players have stepped up to say, here's what's in our, in our products, here's the amount of calories, but that's not a globally defined solution to addressing what is the basic nutritious diet that an individual needs to be to thrive in life and in society. And so I know the Food System Summit will deal with this, and rightly the industry is being pressed on it, and some players in industry are responding and seeing that actually as unlocking new revenue streams, quite frankly. And if you see where the consumer is going, and also where the public policy is and should go, nutrition will be front and center to that dialogue. And we will see, if this is a structural shift in diets is taking place. Just watch the plant-based versus the animal-based. And this is something private sector will ultimately respond to. If not, it's at their peril.
Thank you, Devery. But the interest of time, I'm going to give two questions going forward. Another one to Adriana. Can we discern any differences between urban and rural contexts to see how conflict foods nexus plays out? And then for Chase, the US is one of the few countries in the world that has not signed the UN resolution on the right to food. What do you think of this, and how might development practitioners seize on the momentum on global food systems to sign on? And I think this one could be for the whole panel, not only for Chase. So in the interest of time, Adriana, if you want to talk about urban and rural context for conflict, and then the general one about the UN resolution on right to food, we can then round this out so Ambassador Bodine can bring us home.
Sure. I couldn't hear the last part because the connection here is very poor, but I caught the part about differences between urban and rural. So let me speak about Brazil, which is the context I know best. Here, it depends on whether there is family agriculture in the rural areas. In the parts of Brazil where family agriculture is not only consolidated, but feeds into the national food security system, there is quite a bit of resilience. The problem is that the government has dismantled pretty much all of the food security architecture over the last 2 or 3 years. And so it varies. In areas, for instance, of the Amazon where you don't have family agriculture for a number of reasons, and they're being encroached on by illegal deforestation, the food insecurity situation is terrible. And we've had a lot of media reports this week of children of indigenous communities that have starved to death. It's already in the dozens of reports of cases. In the cities, there is an issue of distribution, but also of nutrition. So the families right now are getting grains, but the price of beef, which is the top export and the most valuable one, is now twice what it was 6 months ago. So families are not being able to eat the type of protein they had, and so the quality of nutrition has gone down quite considerably. And we don't have, here in Rio, for instance, urban agriculture is not yet very consolidated. In Sao Paulo, where it has made strides, it still makes a big contribution. So you have to look at the interlocking aspects of national level systems, but also local systems and how they come into play during the crisis.
Thank you, Adriana. I'm going to open this to all panelists that are on the right to food. And let me repeat the question. The U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that has not signed the UN resolution on the right to food. What do you think of this, and how might development practitioners seize on this momentum on global food systems? And Kelly, you may also have some points from the report. So over to you all, please. And who would like to?
Johanna, I won't, given my role, I probably won't comment on the position of the U.S. with regard to that particular signing. But let me say this: I mean, the United States government is the premier leader and partner of the World Food Program in fighting hunger around the world. I mean, this is an organization that receives almost $3.5 billion from the U.S. government to undertake work in partnership with USAID. In feeding vulnerable people no matter where they are. So I don't want to get into the political side of things, but I will say that the U.S. government has prioritized food security in many ways within USAID and has been a very reliable and favorite partner at WFP. So that's one. But one thing that I wanted to mention and comment on earlier was relating to this lessons learned from the United States. And one thing that I know in the work that we do at the World Food Program is that the work we do on social protection, the work we do on food assistance for assets programs, all of these things have their origins in ideas and concepts to a certain extent that have been piloted throughout history in the United States. One really interesting thing is the parallel between our food assistance for asset programs, where people are building community assets in as a conditionality of receiving food assistance, is very similar to the Works Progress Administration or Civilian Conservation Corps. Our school feeding programs are built on the back of U.S. school feeding concepts, and USDA is a major thought partner there. So I'll say that. And then the last thing I want to comment on is this rural and urban thing. You know, in urban populations, the people who are providing instability and creating instability tend to be middle income individuals or higher income individuals who have the resources and ability to take to the streets and the communication technology to mobilize and coordinate. In rural areas, food-related instability tends to be a question of extreme poverty, desperation, and the ability to be recruited because of that. So the dynamic plays out very differently.
Let me go to Rod and Kelly on this right to food, if I could, because I think this is an important issue. Rod, you talked about rethinking U.S. national security doctrine.
I don't really see a good reason why the U.S. doesn't sign this resolution. I'm not in government anymore. I can say those things. We should sign on to the Law of the Sea, and we should sign the Convention on Biological Diversity. I mean, it seems like increasingly hard to justify position if we want to, win hearts and minds internationally on a great many challenges.
Thank you. And Kelly?
Yeah, and I agree with Rod, and I think what I was going to say on this, on the signing the right to food aspect was this relates to what he was talking about on the National Security 3.0. And I think what we tried to do in the report is to view hunger and the right to food as the title of the report says, peace through food. And I think when you recognize food and its importance like that, and you get the political will behind that to see that and refocus your national security strategies around these sort of threats, I think that goes a long way to then moving the U.S. and to signing something like that. So I think it all has to go to refocusing around what we see as national security.
Thank you. I think I'd love to continue this conversation, but I want to give Ambassador Bodine the last word to sum up and to respond to some of the questions that have been posed to our panelists. in what I think has been an excellent set of conversations. Just want to mention, Deborah, there's one thing in the chat you might have some information on and your thoughts. Could drones be used more extensively to deliver food?
Well, sure. Yes, the short answer is yes, and getting to the last mile delivery, and also making use of other new technologies that are in play. And I'll tell you, one of the players is also a partner of World Food Program, who I'm impressed by is UPS. So I would say take a look at some of the work that UPS is doing.
Okay. Ambassador Bodine, the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you all. This has been a terrific hour's conversation. And I want to thank the Stimson Center for partnering with us and hosting this event today, and a number of the panelists and, hopefully some of the audience who were part of the working group. This was, I think, one of the more interesting and important of the reports we've done, and I'm a big fan of all of our reports, but this one seemed to pull together work that we've done on climate and migration, on a whole continuum of problems, very much as Rod was talking about in the intelligence community, that when you start with one, you end up moving to the next and then seeing its connection to another. As we were doing the working groups, this was probably the most complex, converging, compounding risk that we've ever tackled. Not to say that climate change and water was simple, but this one brought all of them together and also brought it into a very clear and distinct human dimension. This idea that food is a right, a human right, shouldn't even be a question for debate, but regrettably it still is. And in fact, food is used, as we've talked about, it's been securitized, it's been protected, it's been weaponized. And I do a lot of work on Yemen and have seen this up close. It's a basic element of life and of dignity. I think we did focus on how it converges with instability. And I agree with Rod that it's time to do a national security 3.0, and we'll use the term actorless threats. One of my takeaways from this is great phrase, that we need to get away from the hard power threats to the actorless threats. And this is definitely one of them. At the same time, it's a little sad that the only way that we may be able to get some policymakers' attention on what is a basic human right is to put it in security terms. That only if you can link it to insecurity can you get some of the political will that we've been talking about. I'm more than willing to do that if it is what moves the conversation forward. I would prefer that we accept it as a right and move on that basis. But if I have to put it in security terms, those are valid and real, and we'll go there. I also want to thank Adriana for bringing up the, yes. Sure. I agree with you, Adriana. Thank you for bringing up the food insecurity is a very good catch-all phrase. It tends to blend out the issue. We're talking about hunger. We're talking about famine. We're talking about communities being decimated by the fact that they don't have access to food and they don't have access to nutritional food. It is absolutely a question of access and distribution. One of the data points that was very interesting to me as we worked on this was that we already produce, we the world, produce sufficient food, but it's not getting to enough people and it's not getting to too many people. And it's often not nutritional. And so I think we need to talk about what food insecurity means. It means children whose physical and intellectual cognitive abilities are forever stunted, and what this means to a community. What does this mean to the prospects for economic development, for resilience going forward? And then from there, you get, if you don't answer these questions, what does it mean for instability? And we've had to walk it back from the insecurity down to the human right. But we do need to change the normative vocabulary and the framework, and then put it in terms that our policymakers around the world can accept. This is obviously an ongoing conversation, and it's going to be going on within the private sector. Thank you, Devry. It's going on at the UN and any number of other institutions. I do want to commend the World Food Program, by the way. You guys do fabulous work. You have gotten the recognition you deserve for saving people around the world, and your shift to resilience, I think, is going to be a major step forward. So I want to thank everyone who put so much time and effort into this, especially to Kelly, especially to Alistair, and all the others who were part of our working group. And again, thank you to Stimson.
Thank you, Ambassador Bodine. Thank you to all the panelists for a wonderful conversation, which I always say could go on for another hour. And I think we should come away with this with a couple of points. The idea that we need a new national security 3.0 to deal with actual threats, that we need to bring it into the United Nations again and get the right to food to be something that is a simple fix to be ratified as a commitment. And certainly the work of ISD and Stimson continue as we look at these issues as an important part, not only of the US national security debate, but more important of the multilateral impacts that we have working with other nations. So thank you again. It's exactly noon. We finished on time. And your comments are welcome. This has been recorded. It's available on both the Stimson website and I believe also on the ISD website for you. And there are reports available at the same place. And for all speaker bios, please go to their websites. They're all impressive, and I think you'll want to read about them. So it's noon, so I can say good afternoon, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you to everybody.